Hi and welcome. I am doing this video because the verb to be in English is not a match for the way that we think of the verb to be in Tibetan. So it's this is not going to be an exhaustive lesson. It's just to give you a bit of an introduction to some of the ways that is, am, and are different, are used slightly differently and conceptualized slightly differently in English and Tibetan. So before you get dug into a lot of Tibetan studies and get disoriented with why are they using yin when you think they should be using re, this will hopefully give you at least a beginning of a taste of why some of these things are happening. So the sources that I have, I mean, aside from teachers, teachers in general don't typically recognize this stuff. Just like as English speakers, we don't know all of the finer points of grammar, but fortunately, a couple of good authors have sort of dug into this idea of um, what we're going to call egophoric and heterophoric. So I'll just write that here, egophoric. Oops, I'm still in my Tibetan keyboard. I'll switch over. And heterophoric. Now, these are just big words, I guess, scientific sounding words, but they're linguistics terms, I guess. And there's a textbook on colloquial Lhasa Tibetan by Tsetan Chenjore, who initially kind of addressed this, at least in my experience. And then there is I think it's called Speak Fluent Tibetan by Franziska Ertle, which goes a little bit further into helping Westerners understand what's going on in the Tibetan expression. So egophoric words are words that particularly highlight your personal perspective, like so your ego, right? Like so in English, when we say am, it's always connected with I. So I, the egophoric, is always am. Whereas in Tibetan, it's not necessarily so. So if you think that am is always yin, it's okay as a kind of a beginning standpoint, but you will run into questions about why Tibetans are not using it the same way you think they should be, because am does not equal yin. So I'm just going to write that. Um, I don't know how to do a not equal to sign on here. Yin, I guess I'll put a space. Whoops. Sorry. Is not equivalent to am. This is something that needs to be a little bit understood. Am, in certain contexts, it is am in some sentences, but it's not always am. Sometimes it's is. And sometimes it's are when it's we are. So you need to start to divorce these ideas a little bit. So egophoric, grounded in the self, from the self's perspective, perhaps we can say. And then the opposite, or in contradistinction to that, you have heterophoric, grounded in the other, or making reference to other. to the other. So that's just a very general idea of what this is. So we'll go down a little bit and just start looking at how do you say is, am, and are. Okay, this is not such an easy question to address. We'll give ourselves some blank space here. So I'll just give a brief overview, a little chart here that you can keep as a reference. So you can make yourself a print screen or make your own notes, handwritten notes as you prefer. So yin, I guess I'll write both. I'll write the Tibetan, the Wylie, and the since I'm saying the pronunciation, you don't need the pronunciation. I'll just write the Tibetan. Yin is egophoric. It refers to, for example, identity. It's also used as one of the pieces of the puzzle when you're making the past tense, and also one of the pieces of the puzzle when you're making the future tense. So again, this is not exhaustive, but this is a good starting point to get you understanding where you're probably going to see this particle yin, and which some say even in it of itself is not necessarily a verb. It marks verbs. Sometimes it functions as a verb, perhaps. I'm not a linguist. This is just what I've come to understand in a practical matter. So then you have re. So you're probably already familiar with re from other examples. And so normally in English, we always talk about this as being the third person, but here we're going to just try to shift our attention a little bit to think of it as heterophoric, just to give you a bit more flexibility with your orientation. So heterophobic, and this is, I would say, as a good general principle, is more associated with general fact. That's what I find really useful as just keeping that in mind, as re is typically talking about a general fact as opposed to identity. And it's also used as one of the building blocks for the past tense and the future tense for heterophoric cases. And these are the basic ones we're going to look at, but we'll go beyond that into other forms of is, and you'll see why there is a little bit further on. But essentially, ye also works as the verb is in a different way. So ye is, am, are, in a sense, you'll see why, is also egophoric. And it functions more to indicate the existence of something, which is what you'll see in many texts, colloquial texts. You can also just recognize that it's often used to explain where something is located, so location. And also possession, like I have something, it's in my possession. It is in my possession. And it's also a building block for the present tense. Then we have the heterophoric equivalent. Oops. Sorry. Ooh. Heterophoric is dug, which also indicates existence. location, possession. It's also used even though it's not typically egophoric. When you're talking about your own feelings, you actually use duk. So feelings are sort of external to the self, if you can think of it that way. So feelings, and it's also a building block for the present tense. So yin, re, ye, and duk. All of these express am, is, are in different ways in relation to these different categories. So we'll give ourselves a new screen here. I'll get the line to go down a bit. I'm going to give you a couple of bonus structures just because these also come up a lot, and they are combination ones that are very useful, and you will see them very, very often. And so I will give you my own sort of placeholders for these mentally as I come across them. This is how I tend to translate them in my mind. So you have your re. So this is a combination of ye and re. And what you end up with in English typically is there is, or often it can be just translated as there are. And in some cases, there is doesn't really fit. And so what I've started to think of it as is that the is or are generally known to be. That seems to work pretty well in sentences where there's a yore, but it doesn't really work in English if you try to translate it as there is or there are. Sometimes that can be understood to be helpful because essentially what you have here is like ye, so it exists, and re, which is a general fact. So it's sort of like it exists as a general fact. That's a handy way to think of it from what I've discovered. So that's yore. Then there's another one that you might hear a little bit further along, but I thought this was useful to introduce here. I'm sure we'll come up with more examples in future videos. But this is one that might not be so obvious. So it's re, whoops, re, duk. So re, duk. You also have this idea of evidentiary levels in Tibetan, so or evidentiary perspectives. So re, duk. So if you break it down, it is a fact, and duk is sometimes used as being like personal experience. In this case, it doesn't really help that much. What I would say is that we're going to give some examples later that where it's, I guess the closest thing is maybe supposed to be. So don't worry too much about that one. It will become more familiar as we start looking at those a little bit more. But just so that you have an idea of what my current mental placeholder is for reduk, this is kind of the most useful way I've thought to express it. I've learned to express it from one of my teachers. So, and if I discover more nuanced interpretations and additional interpretations, of course, I will share them as I learn them. So we'll start from the top and look at ye. And we'll go down here a little bit and just give ourselves a fresh screen. So here are some examples of yin in action. So you're familiar with this one. Kerang pema yinbe. So are you pema? So in this case, the yin is not am, it's are. because in the question form, you're expecting the egophoric answer. So the question contains the egophoric form because you're looking for the egophoric answer. This is how you can hopefully more comfortably think of it so that you don't get confused with the way it is in English. And then you can say nga, whoops, pe, ma, yin. So I am Pema, and this is egophoric. It's referring specifically to me and to my identity. And now we're going to look at a really, this is one of the examples. This next example is something that you would not expect in English, but you will see it in more colloquial books now. And this is just your heads up to not be surprised when you see this. So you will see Mei, Ming, oops, Pe, Ma, Yin. So if you try to translate this thinking that yin is am, you will always be on the wrong foot. So my name is Pema. So here it's is, and it's an egophoric is. So Nye Ming Pema Yin means my name is Pema, and the is means it pertains particularly to me and my identity, to my ego, my self. And this is correct in Tibetan. It may not be used very much, or especially not taught very much to Westerners because it can be so disorienting, but you should be aware that you will hear this and it now hopefully will not be so much of a surprise for you. Next, as I was saying, we have, okay, so Trom La, and then we have an irregular here. Chin, oops, Yin. So Nga Tromla Chimba Yin. Chin is the irregular form of to go in the past tense. I guess you can think of it that way. I mean, it's a slightly different verb, but it's just more commonly used for past tense of go. So Nga Tromla Chimba Yin. I went. I went to the market. So this yin is not am, is, or was. It is went, or in this case, the whole thing of this is went. Jim yin. Yin, the yin is like was, I suppose, if it was disconnected somehow. But for nga, and then whatever it is, yin, this is past tense. I was doing something. And then we have the future. Nga, tom, la, zhou, yi, yin. Zhou yi yin. So yi yin or gi yin, or depending on the particle being used, this is the future form. So nga gi yin, I will. So I was, nga ba yin, and then nga yi yin, will. This yi, don't get too disoriented by that. The reason you will see yi is because there are 4 different forms of this particle, this genitive particle, or of, the of particle. So after a root letter with no suffix, it's yi. That's the reason why it's just showing as yi. I think in most colloquial texts you will find it as gi, just to simplify things and not confuse people too much with Tibetan spelling. But the correct form is yi, droyiyin. Whether you pronounce it drogiyin or droyiyin, most people will not mind too much. I mean, they'll understand you either way. So, but yiyin is more grammatically correct. And this is according to Sumchupa, which is the grammatical guidelines that Tibetans still follow after many hundreds of years. So So this is yin, an overview of yin. So question form, egophoric, answer form, egophoric, like possession, egophoric, and then past tense and future tense, first person. So next we'll have a look at j'ai. So first example, kong gi. So you'll see this of particle here is gi because it's following the suffix nga. You can start to get used to that, but it's not terribly important at this point if you're still just beginning. Kong gi ning pema j'ai. So her name is Pema. Is heterophoric, meaning for the other person. Some other person's name is Pema. Her name is Pema, or his name is Pema. And the same thing for the question, right? So Kongi Ming Pema Rebe, same format. You don't need to make any big change. Let's say Kong Ha Ri Ne Re Be. Kong Ari Ne Rebe, is she from America? Kong Ha Ri Ne Re. Oops. Re. She is from America. It's just a general fact about a third person. And then we have the past tense. So kong gis ka bar tang ba je. So here the kongi, by her, by because we're in the past tense, a phone call was made. So the bare is was. You can also use song as an alternative to bare. It's I tend to think of it as happened, just kind of a convenient way to think about how that's translated. So kongi kabartang bare, she called, she gave a phone call, she made a phone call. And then future tense, kong. No need for the gi this time for future tense. Kabartang gi re. So this time we replace the ba with the gi, and that becomes the future tense. So kong kabartang gire, she will make a phone call. So the earlier one, she did make a phone call, or it happened that she made a phone call, and then future tense, she will make a phone call. And in both cases, the re is there. So bare and gire. Yeah, fortunately in Tibetan, lots of verbs are verb phrases. So it's like, I mean, in the sense that they are nouns that have been turned into verbs. So a lot of them just use one verb like dang or jag to conjugate them. So I might make some videos about that just to try to simplify learning your verbs. And for myself as well, obviously. Okay, so this was for re. then we were going to talk about ye. So ye is also used for is, but in this sense, ye is, but for possession and location and existence and present tense. So we'll look at some examples for ye. I'll just put that at the top there. So we'll use the first example here. Kiran la teb ye be. So kiran la teb ye be. So in English, you'll see in some of the transliterations that I'll be giving probably soonish. The way I would write this is you in, because la is in, and then I would just put in square brackets, in possession of book are, and then the be is the question mark, right? So the question in English, we always say, do you have a book? But the to have as a verb is not exactly what's happening here. You can absolutely think of it that way, and it will be useful that way. You can think of this as to exist. If you find that easier to wrap your head around, I just personally right now I'm finding it easier with this different perspective to think of it as being in. It's that you is still in, it's just in a different, or sorry, are, is and are, but just with a different perspective, meaning this existential are as opposed to, or possession are instead of identity are. Because when you come across you in other contexts, it really is still just is or are. And anyway, so do you have a book is how we would normally say it in English. But you could equally say, are you in possession of a book? Which is correct, although English people would probably not say it that way. But I'm finding it more helpful to think of the structure that way. And then the answer, nga, la, teb, ye. So I am in possession of a book. Or there is a book in my possession. You could think of it that way. There is a whole other animal. Honestly, don't get too hung up in all of these things, but just trust that the more you expose yourself to all of these different varieties of endings more and more often, they will start to become natural possibilities for translation and conversation. And then a different form for liking. This is also just a very practical one that I'll introduce to you here, which is, okay, nga, nga, yak, la, ga, bo, ye. So in this case, in my sort of my personal preference for translation, so I yaks in possession of liking am. And this is I like yaks. This is Or you could also think of it as I have a liking. Oops. I was always getting continually confused about how to express when you like something. I mean, it's also just a matter of using it many, many times, and then it just becomes a habit. But I don't know, for myself, I like to have an intellectual understanding of what's going on actually in the sentence so that when I want to make different kinds of sentences, I know what's happening so I can be creative and make new structures. So this is how I like to think of this year. So I am in possession of liking yaks, something like this. And then we have a location. So 걔랑 New, we'll spell it New York. Nee. Sorry. New York la. Je be. Are you in New York? Right? Are you 걔랑 New York la je be? Are you in New York? So again, this la is functioning as in. And in this case, je is are, right? Is, am, are. It's to be. Are you in New York? And this way, you don't have to think of it as have because it wouldn't make sense anymore. So here it stays as are you in New York? And again, because it's egophoric and you're asking a you question, you're expecting the person to answer the egophoric you. So I'm not perfectly sure of my spelling for New York here, but anyways, this is my guess on the fly here. Nga New York la you. I am in New York. So next we'll have a look at duk. Oops. So con la deb du. Oops. Du ge. Does he have a book or is he in possession of a book? And then the answer in the same heterophoric sense, right? Con la deb. Oops. Sorry. Duk. Con la deb duk. He does have a book or he has a book. And then we'll do the liking version. So con mo o la ga bo du ge. Con momo la ga bo du ge. Does he like momos? Does he have a liking for momos? Is he in possession of a liking for momos? Is he in possession of a liking for momos? And of course the answer is con mo mo. I hope I'm spelling momos right. Anyway, spelling is another challenge for another day, I guess. Mo do do. Con momo la gabo do. He does have a liking for momos, or he does like momos. He is in possession of a liking form almost. So again, it can stay as is in that case. And then location. Con to ron to la. Okay, and now my verbs. De gi. Oops. Du ge. Con tarantula deginduge. This is the correct form, grammatical form for the verb in the present tense. Does he live in Toronto? Does he live in Toronto? Is he living in Toronto? You could think of it if you want to keep this as is in your mind. And then con, oops, to ron to la de gi duk. Then another way of that you'll come across duk is for example, tukpa, I don't know if I'm spelling it right, sorry. Tukpa di shim, oops, bo duk. So this soup is tasty. Tukpa di shimbo duk. This soup is tasty. And you can also, let's say, nga. Even though it's nga and it's normally heterophoric, this is for feelings. So kya gi duk. I'm freezing. Nga kya gi duk. I'm freezing. So even though it's normally, you would think you would say nga kya gi ye, doesn't exactly work. For feelings, you would say nga kya gi duk. It's like saying I have cold on me, a bit like in Welsh. It's external to yourself, even though it's your body that's feeling it. And just don't be discouraged. As I learn more, I will try to give you a better sense of why this all is happening. But for now, that's what I've come to understand up to this point. Then we have yore. So, let's say Tong Kang Di Nala. Sam Go. Again, I'm not sure about my spelling, sorry. Shoes. Sam Go. Yore Be. Are there shoes in this store? Tongkang di nala. Samgo yorebe. Are there shoes? Are there. So there are there. Are there. Yore. And the answer would be yore. Or you could put the full sentence if you want. Yore. There are. And even for personal questions, it also, you'll see this in unusual like it's different from English. 계란 기 자 라 부 구 whoops 구 요 레 베. So in this case, 계란 라 아자 라 부모 요베, is your elder sister in possession of children? And in this case, it doesn't really work with there is. So I suppose you could think of it as, is it the case that there is in possession of your sister children? Anyway, it gets very convoluted, but what you can also just think of is that it's is in general knowledge or something like this. Like it's generally known that your sister has children. That's an easy enough way, I think, to think about it. Like, is your sister known to have children? Is it known that your sister has children? And next, and the answer again would be, whoops, yo re. Next, we're going to have a brief look at re duk. Whoops, duk. Sorry, re duk. This is just a sort of a bonus, useful tip for you to have something in your toolkit of phrases to use, but we will come back to this, and I hopefully will understand this clearer as I learn more. But I will give some examples here. So, konzo, oops, ling ka la dro ya re droya re versus konzo ling, whoops, ka la dro ya re, whoops, do. So this re versus re duk. So re is a general fact, something that you know pretty well for sure. And konzo linkala droya re duk is a little bit less certain. So you might say, okay, they are going to the park for sure is the first version, and then the second version re duk is, I suppose they're going to the park, or I'm pretty sure they're going to the park. I don't know exactly when or which day or the parameters, but it seems pretty likely that they're going to the park. There are other expressions for likely, and those will be the subject of another video, but just so you start to get a little bit familiar with these. We have expressions like yin, sa, re, and yin, gi, re. we'll stick with those maybe now for now, just because they contain the verb yin, but they're used not only with the first person and not only in the egophoric sense. These are more loosely applied everywhere. And this means more like, I tend to think of the sa as likely. So it is likely that, oh, maybe I'll put that next to here just so that it's clear. That I think that's useful. And yingire, most places I've seen and teachers I've heard from, they all seem to like this. I think that. Although when you're reading any particular sentence in Tibetan, you might decide that they're sort of somewhat interchangeable. But the more you work with, the more you practice with native speakers, the more those things will become clear. And I'm looking forward to that as well. I'm starting to use them more, and I will continue to refine my understanding of those. So that's a very big overview of how to say is, am, and are in Tibetan. It's not an easy question, and it's a lot of detail to think about. Don't worry about it. Just, think of this as a very brief overview of the how these markers are used in Tibetan. And so just don't be surprised when you see unexpected forms in Tibetan that you try to directly translate into English and they don't work. So this will help you understand why and what's possibly going on behind the scenes in the grammar itself. So this is a bit of a long one, but thank you for your patience, and I hope it's helpful for you.